In this next IT security installment, we're going to talk about authentication. And there's two concepts with access control and authentication. There's access control and authentication. Basically, the difference is authentication is how we identify who the user is, and access control or authorization is what the user is allowed to do. So authentication is who you are, and authorization is what you can do. Kind of like a driver's license can prove who we are, and then there's information in that driver's license that might indicate what we're allowed to do, and that's all verifiable and vetted by the Division of Motor Vehicles, for example. So you have a third party, but that license is basically is the trust, represents the trust that we have in that organization, and there's features about a driver's license that help us trust that. So we're going to talk about how we do this in IT security and some of the technologies that we use, and also some of the vernacular. So again, authentication is the process of making sure we know who someone is. And in this unit, we're going to talk about secure management of user accounts, all the different types of authentications. We're also going to touch on single sign-on towards the end, which is an important concept in most modern IT infrastructure. All right, so some elements of authentication. You can demonstrate to be genuine or authentic by an example of it. For example, what you have. For example, a key fob to unlock your car or lock your car is something that you have. What you are, for example, something inherent about you, like your fingerprint or facial characteristics. So when someone sees you, they recognize you. That's what you are. What you know is something that is in your brain, something that you know, something you memorized, like the combination to a lock, for example. Where you are could also help identify someone. So if someone's in an area that they would have already had to have been vetted in order to get to that area, that might help. And what you do. So how you do things. We all have certain ways that we do things, and we can use that and measure that to see if someone is who we think they are. We'll talk about some of those. So, I'm sorry, I have this slide here twice. So here's an example of some of the things that I talked about, like a key fob for your car, what you look like, memorizing a lock, for example, what you do, where you are, and so forth. So authentication is the proof of who you are, as I said before. Because only a real authentic person possesses one or more elements, they can confirm the identity and can be used to prevent access by an imposter. The thing that's important to note here is that even though we might recognize someone on the phone, for example, or we might recognize someone when we see them, sometimes we have further ways that we can identify someone. So in computing, we don't want to just rely on one of these things. We want to rely on multiple factors to truly identify someone and vet whether or not they're genuine. So I just talked about a bunch of different ways that we can identify someone. And in many cases, we combine those different identity techniques, and that's multi-factor identification. So the first factor, and I'm going to talk about, if you look along the side of the presentation here, what you know, what you have, what you are, what you do, and where you are each different factors for authentication. So when we talk about single factor authentication, that means identifying a user or a person based on only one of those credentials, where two-factor would be using two of those, and three-factor would be three of those. It's not common to see more than three-factor. So let's talk about passwords. So when a user is logging into a system, they typically identify themselves with a username, and then they have a password, which is a secret combination of letters, numbers, and/or characters that only the user should have knowledge of. I think most of us are familiar with this. It's the most common type of authentication that we use. All of you probably have a username and password to many different systems that you access. So all of us are familiar with this technique. It's also one of the weakest methods to protect IT resources. So it's not only the most common, but it's also the most weak. And if we were in class, I would ask you, if it's so weak, why is it the most common? And usually the answer that comes forth is the fact that it's easy. It's an easy technology to implement. It's easy for people to use. And if you think about it, there's lots of other factors that we could use. For example, a lot of you probably have something like Gmail or Yahoo or any kind of service online that does allow two-factor authentication. And many of you probably don't use it because it's more difficult to use it. If you ask any user on the street if they want to use multi-factor authentication, typically they don't because it's a pain. It's a lot of extra work to use those systems. So a lot of people don't like to use them. But if we're trying to protect IT resources and assets, it's a good idea to implement some of these other factors. It's also a good idea to try to address some of the weaknesses with passwords. since it is typically our first line of defense. So one of the weaknesses with passwords is human memory. Human beings can only memorize a limited number of items, and passwords place heavy loads on human memory in multiple ways. One of the stories that I always recall when I think about password weakness in human memory, some people say, well, I can memorize 16 characters for my password, and that might be true. A lot of us probably can. But I recall when the telephone company was first developing the technology for being able to dial a telephone number without having to call an operator. Back in the old days, if you wanted to make a phone call, you would turn a crank on the side of the phone and it would ring an operator, and you would tell the operator who you wanted to talk to, and they would connect you to that phone. But when the phone company started developing technology that would allow you to dial a phone number, for example, to call someone directly, thus bypassing the operator, there was a lot of reasons they wanted to do that. But one of the challenges they found is how long can we make a phone number so that humans can remember them? And if you look today, almost all phone numbers are 7 digits if you don't include the area code, which makes it 10 digits. And that's a pretty decent number of digits in a phone number. And in their studies, their usability studies, the phone company did studies to see how long the average person can memorize a phone number that they read in the telephone book without taxing short-term memory. So what they were trying to find out is if you looked in a phone book, hopefully some of you remember what a phone book is. We don't really see them very much anymore. But they were trying to discover if you had a person look in a telephone book, see a phone number, without too much effort, could they turn around and pick up a telephone handset and dial that number? And if you remember, it took a long time to dial a phone number in those days because it was a rotary dial. They didn't have buttons yet back then. The technology, when it first came out, was a rotary, so you had to put your finger in a little hole and spin it around, and if you messed up, you'd have to hang up and try again. So what they discovered was that 5 was the magic number. Most humans, most people could remember about 5 digits without taxing their short-term memory, even people that had some cognitive disorders. Remember, they wanted to make the phone accessible to all people. So 5 was the magic number. That's really not that long. And some of you are saying, wait a minute, Brian, phone numbers are not 5 digits. But if you go back to the 1930s and the 1940s and look at an old phone book, you see a 7-digit number, but the first 2 digits are actually letters. For example, when I was a kid, my telephone number was OL42097, OL42097. The OL would have been 65. Of course, that's not my phone number anymore. But even the phone company realized that human memory is a weakness, and they had to account for that. They had to find a way to make it work. And what they came up with was the combination of a word plus the 5 digits. And hopefully the word wouldn't change very often within one town. You only had trouble if you were calling outside your local central office. So it is a weakness, and it's something that we have to deal with and something that we have to be aware of. Not all users want to use complex passwords. So this leads us to password weaknesses. So the weakness in human memory is what causes the password weakness that your book talks about. So most effective passwords are long and complex, but most users can't memorize those very long and complex passwords. So users, because they have to memorize passwords for many different accounts, most people don't want to have a unique password for each account, so that's another weakness. You memorize one password that's relatively complex, and then they apply it to all of their accounts, which could be a security hazard. So many securities policies mandate the passwords expire after a certain period of time, which forces people to create new passwords. And again, once somebody memorizes a password for a while, it's difficult for them to memorize a new one. So again, that detracts from the complexity that we might have for passwords. So a weak password is a password that uses any common words or phrases, like the word princess. I know it seems like a strange word to use here, but a surprisingly large number of people use the word princess for their password. I'm not sure why. A very short password is certainly very weak. Any predictable sequence of characters, like ABC123. Any personal information, for example, the name of your dog, your child, the name of your car, something along those lines. There are predictable patterns. So when an attempt to create a strong password, users often follow predictable patterns, like appending, so for example, combining letters, numbers, and punctuation by appending one character set to another, add different letters, for example, Caitlin 1, Cheer 99, etc. That's very common. Sometimes they'll put a period in between, and a lot of these things are pretty predictable that people are going to use these types of passwords. They might replace letters with numbers and think that that's going to stop or characters and think that's going to stop an attacker. If I know that the most likely password someone's going to use is password, then I could try password with different variations of numbers because it's easy for a user to remember if they replace the numbers because it still sort of spells the word. I'm sure a lot of you use passwords that look something like this. So they're aware of all these patterns and they're aware of these tricks that users try to do to try to make their password more complex. So again, that's another weakness. And password reuse is certainly a major problem because people, they don't want to have to memorize all these different passwords. In some cases, you simply can't. I teach for about 7 different colleges right now, and each one of those colleges has anywhere from 3 to 5 different systems that I have to have passwords for. I could at any given time have 30 or 40 different accounts for email, for grading, for Blackboard, and so forth and so on. It's just not possible for me to memorize different accounts for all those systems. So we have to have some way to facilitate that. So somebody did an analysis of theft of 32 million passwords, which is a pretty good sample size of passwords. It's statistically significant, 32 million passwords. 30% of users had created passwords of only 5 or 6 characters, which is extremely short. 12% were 9 characters, and only 1 in every 5 users created password that was one of the 5,000 most common passwords, which means 1 in every 5 people had a password that was one of 5,000 most common passwords. So if you're an attacker and you knew those 5,000 most common passwords, which you can just go look up online, then it would be very easy for you to crack passwords for users that chose those passwords. I can almost guarantee you that in any organization that doesn't have very stringent requirements on passwords and enforces those restrictions and requirements, they probably have a lot of those 5,000 most common passwords somewhere in their systems. And here they are. Here's the top 10. So number 1 is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. That was the most common. 290,000 people, or 290,000 passwords were 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Password was number 4. You can see Princess was number 6, which seems kind of random to me. The other ones I get, but Princess I wasn't sure about. Rock You seems kind of odd as well. But in any event, these are the top 10. Even ABC 123 is on there. With a pretty significant number of people that use that, 17,542. So again, these are predictable. People use these predictable passwords very frequently when we don't enforce restrictions on those passwords. In the lab, I think I'm going to ask you to, in one of the practical assignments, I'll ask you to set up Windows, for example, to require users to have more complex passwords that expire periodically, which helps prevent some of these weaknesses with passwords. So some of the attacks on passwords, probably one of the easiest ways to attack passwords is going to be social engineering, which we've talked about previously. So with social engineering, you can use phishing emails, shoulder surfing, in other words, looking over their shoulder, dumpster diving to find evidence of anything that might indicate what passwords are. Another way is to capture the passwords using a keylogger, protocol analyzer, in other words, something like Wireshark to try to capture the traffic in transit, using a man-in-the-middle attack, so that you're in between whatever's authenticating the user and the user so that you can intercept those passwords, which is kind of how phishing attacks technically work. It's really, a phishing attack is a combination of a man in the middle and social engineering. And then resetting attacks, which is where the attacker gains physical access to a computer to reset the password. And that's certainly a problem with physical computers, although many of our devices now protect against that. If you try to put the wrong password in X number of times, it will lock the device, or in some cases, it completely destroys the data on the device. Offline cracking. So if we want to crack a password, and when we say the term cracking a password, what we mean is somehow figuring out what the password is through technical means. So social engineering is breaking passwords by getting it from someone, then the man in the middle and some of those other technical attacks. But password cracking is a special topic in password in finding out what someone's password is, because we're using some technology to try to crack that password and find out what it is. And there's a couple different ways to do it, but typically we're guessing. That's kind of the most basic method. We're guessing what different passwords, we're guessing what the password might be. The problem with that, and I'm sure all of you are aware of this, if let's say I'm trying to guess the password to log into a Windows account on a Microsoft Windows, I'm sure all of you have used Microsoft Windows at some point in your life, and you've got that login screen. And if you put the wrong password in, it lets you try again up to, I think, 3 times. And then it pauses for a while and then tells you that you have to try again. And eventually it'll lock the account. So we don't get a lot of tries when we're physically in front of a machine trying to crack a password. That goes for cell phones, smartphones, tablets, all the different types of systems that we might be trying to crack a password, even web services where we're trying to log into someone's email or something like that. You really don't get a lot of tries to try to crack that password. And the reason for that is because designers know that a lot of users are going to use those 5,000 most common passwords, and it won't be that hard to guess. And it really wouldn't take a computer that long to try to type 5,000 possible passwords to see which accounts it can break into. So one of the easier ways to crack passwords in that scenario is if we can get our hands on the file that stores the password. Now, when I say that, it's not a file that contains in plain text all of the passwords for a particular system. Typically, the password files are hashed. We've learned about encryption in other courses. I'm sure you've learned about hashing. It is a prerequisite for this course to understand a little bit about how hashing works. But if you have just that digital, that hash, that signature for the password, the hash output of that password, or some people call it the digest. So if you have only the digest, you don't know the password. But what you could do if you had the digest is try to find another combination of characters that produces that exact same digest. And then of course you will know the password once you do that. So that's what offline cracking is. It's getting a hold of that digest so that we can try to brute force to figure out what that password is. And there's a variety of methods to do that. So as I said, let me skip through these some of these lines I just talked about. But so basically, the attacker steals the password digests. They load that file onto their own computers, and they use the hashing algorithms on their own computer to try to figure out what combination of characters is going to produce that exact same digest. And the most basic way to do that is brute force, where you start with 0 and you try every possible combination of letters, numbers, and characters to create candidates and test them against the digest to see, and just do that until you arrive at the answer. So there's automated brute force attack programs where you tell it the length of the passwords that you want to try, the character set that you're using, like ASCII, for example, or UTF-8, the language that you're using, patterns, skips, so you have some extra options in there. But basically, that's a brute force. You're basically trying every single combination of letters and numbers and characters and whatnot within whatever character set you're using, up to whatever length you're trying to test, and you see if you can find a match. That obviously can take a very long time for moderately complex passwords, but for simple passwords, you can certainly crack them with brute force. A dictionary attack is where we're going to take a list of words, or we're going to create sort of a pre-compiled list of candidate terms, words, and characters that make sense for us to try first before we try a brute force. So if we already know that there's a finite set of words that are common for passwords, and when I say words, I mean just any combination of characters that we've come up with, then we can use that to attack the password to try to find the digest. Your book talks about the birthday attack. Basically, the birthday attack is just discussing the concept that if you take a room of people, even if there's only 30 people in a room, or say 50 people in a room, the odds that 2 of those people have the same birthday are pretty high. It's surprisingly high, actually, statistically speaking anyway. So if you try to take a survey of a room with a moderately large number of people, you're going to find people that have the same date of birth. And maybe not necessarily the same year, but certainly the same day. We only have 365 days to work with, so we have 100 people in a room. It's a pretty good chance that 2 are going to share the same birthday. Same thing with passwords. In any given population, you're going to have some overlap. So that's kind of what they're talking about here. So with a dictionary attack, we basically take a dictionary of characters that we think might be the passwords on a particular system. We calculate all of the hashes, and then we compare that to the hashes that we stole from whatever system we're trying to gain access to. A hybrid attack is a variation of the dictionary attack. It combines the dictionary attack with the brute force attack. So we alter the dictionary by adding numbers to the end of the password, spelling words backwards, slightly misspelled words, including all the special characters. So all of the other ways that people try to make their passwords more complex. Fast forward through all that. So all of that is about sort of, that all sort of falls under that brute force style attack. Even the dictionary attack, you're really just trying all these different combinations. You're just doing it in a custom order, really, to try to discover it faster. If you do that with, say, the top 5,000 passwords, there's a good chance you're going to find a match. Rainbow tables is if we say that the The longest part of doing a brute force attack is calculating those hashes. Because if you know the hash algorithm that was used to create the digest, you simply use that hashing algorithm, but they take processing time. And maybe that's not a big deal when you're logging into a system one time, but when you want to try thousands and thousands of passwords per second, in order to effectively crack that password much more quickly, then time is of the essence. The faster we can do that, the better, especially when we have very complex passwords. So a rainbow table is sort of a pre-compiled list of all of the digests for various algorithms, hashing algorithms, I should say, and we use that output to try to find the matching digest. So instead of using actual words, we use the rainbow table, which has the digest already calculated for us, and we compare it against the digest that we stole. It can be used repeatedly for attacks on other passwords. It's much faster than a dictionary attack, obviously. The amount of memory needed on the machine that you're using to carry out the attack is greatly reduced because, again, a lot of the work has been done for us. So that's a rainbow table. And then this leads us to password collections. So rainbow tables, if you're wondering where to get one, you can go on the dark web or the dark net, whatever you want to call it, and you can go and purchase and sometimes just download copies of these. So every time somebody compromises a system and they get a list of passwords, a lot of times they get published in some of these things like Pastebin and whatnot for other attackers to go and use. And that now becomes part of that library of possible passwords that people might be using. So that's where a lot of these rainbow tables and these dictionary attacks come from, or the hybrid approach to the dictionary attack. So some of the things that we can do, so there's 4 primary defenses against these password attacks. Number 1, and most important, is going to be password complexity. Using credential management so that users are not relying on their memory, because memory is a big weakness. So if we can somehow get away from that, that will certainly help. Password hashing algorithms will certainly help, where you use password hashing algorithms and include things like salts, or that can do special tricks to kind of make it harder for the user or for the attacker to crack the password. As far as complexity goes, so do not use passwords that consist of dictionary words or any phonetic words. Do not repeat characters or use sequences like ABC 123 or QWERTY. Don't use birthdays, family member names, pet names, anything that could be commonly known. You wouldn't want to use as part of a password. Not necessarily because the attacker is going to know those things, but because they are words that the attacker might know about. Even though no one will know that you used to call your car Ashley in high school or something, and you use that for by the way, I never called my car that, but just thinking of a random name, even though the attacker might not know that, that is a real name that might exist in a dictionary somewhere that, is going to get combined with other words and things like that, so it's certainly possible. You don't want to use any short passwords. Your password should be a minimum of 15 characters. This is when most users will roll their eyes and say, 15 characters? Good Lord, how can I create passwords 15 characters long and doesn't have any words in it and is just completely random that I'm going to memorize? A lot of users have difficulty memorizing those. So longer password is always more secure than a short password. And you can use this equation to figure out exactly how much more secure it's going to be, or just take a look at this table here. Assuming 95 possible characters, which is typical of a US keyboard layout. So assuming 95 possible characters, if you have only 2 characters, that's 9,025 possible passwords. If the length is 2. When we step up to a length of 6, that's 735 billion possible passwords at a length of 6. So that's significantly more. Again, if you limit that to just combinations of characters that are meaningful, like real words and things like that, then that number is significantly less. So even if you combine uppercase, lowercase, and numbers and things like that, I mean, even then it's significantly less and much easier to attack. So you can also use non-keyboard characters. Those 95 characters that are on our keyboard, most people use for passwords. If you really wanted to get fancy, you could use you can use characters that are not in the standard UTF-8 or ASCII character set, or that are not on the keyboard itself. And how would you do that? In most operating systems, you could bring up a screen where you can use non-standard characters. This is a pain, though. It's a good idea. It's a neat idea. but good grief, this would be a pain in the neck to have to bring this up every time you try to log into your email, for example. It would work though, and it would probably make your password rather secure. But because most attackers are not going to have libraries that include any of these characters. But again, it's kind of a pain to do that, but you could do it. And then finally, credential management technologies are important, and this is how we can keep track or keep track, store passwords, and store securely passwords for ourselves that we use for different services. So one of the tips that book talks about is do not leave your computer running unattended, even if it's in a locked office. Somebody could come in and change your password without you knowing about it until it's too late. Do not set up a computer to boot from an optical or USB drive, because that can allow them to reset passwords on the physical machine, although that wouldn't help us on a domain unless, of course, they reset the domain controller password. Password protect your BIOS, or well, now it's UEFI on most modern computing platforms, but the textbook we're using hasn't really caught up. But you could password protect the basically password protect the firmware, and then physically lock the computer so it cannot be opened, so somebody can't get in there and flip the dip switches, for example, to reset passwords. We want to change passwords as frequently as possible. Do not reuse old passwords. Never write passwords down. You can go into almost any office in America and see passwords on sticky notes somewhere in somebody's cubicle or somebody's office. You see them on monitors. You see them on their keyboards, in drawers, and all sorts of things. But again, an attacker needs only to find one of those sticky notes to get access. Do not allow the computer to automatically sign into an account or record a password, so that the login is not necessary. I think a lot of us do that option. A lot of us with websites that we go to periodically, it's just easier to let it save your password. If you book airline tickets every once in a while and you don't want to have to memorize your password for American Airlines or something like that, or Southwest Airlines, you could just have your computer save it. But then anybody who gets a hold of your laptop could use your account to log into American Airlines and buy a ticket to Hawaii, right? Now that in that example, it's not a big deal because you could just cancel the ticket, I suppose. But Amazon is a good example of this. A lot of us use the one-click ordering with Amazon. One day, somebody sat at my computer at my office, not nefariously. Somebody just sat down in my office, and we were having a conversation about something. And while we were talking about home improvement, I think, and he was looking up different parts for toilets or something on Amazon, and he's just looking up things, and he was putting them in my cart so that he could look at the price and see how much it would cost to ship it while we were talking. And I forgot about it, and later on I went to my computer and I went to order a box of tea because I ran out of tea bags. It's just easier to order on Amazon. They ship it, it comes in the next day. So I went ahead and clicked the one-click order for tea bags, and the next day I get my tea bags and about 3 other boxes of toilet parts. The flapper and the whatever, stuff that I didn't need. And I was like, why did I get this stuff? And that was why. So, because everything was already saved. So certainly good to be cognizant of those things. Do not enter passwords on public access computers while using an unencrypted wireless network. That can make it susceptible to a man-in-the-middle attack. So password management applications are a secure solution for credential management, and it relies on technology rather than human memory to store and manage passwords. As I said, a lot of us have to memorize a lot of passwords for lots of different systems. And until a single sign-on becomes a global reality, this is going to be the world that we deal with, and we have to give users some kind of a tool to keep track of these passwords. Certainly we don't want to try to make passwords less secure, but we also need to give them some way to keep those passwords stored in a secure way instead of writing them on a sticky note. So one of those options is password management applications, which allow you to write down a password, for example, not so much write it down, but to put it, and store it in some computer program, usually called a vault, where you have to go and open that vault with a special password to see your list of passwords. So I use one of these vaults. I use one called on Zoho, so it's vault.zoho.com, and I log into my Zoho account, and from there I have a passphrase that I have to put in to access my encrypted passwords. Kind of the neat thing about this is my passphrase cannot be reset by the company that hosts this service. It's only something that I know. So if I lose that password, I lose access to all of that information. So I have to make sure that I at least memorize that one password. But I can make that a super complicated, really hard to memorize password because it's the only one I have to memorize. It's the only passphrase that I have to keep in my head. Because every time I go to access any service that I use that requires a complicated password, when I create the password, I add it to that little password manager program and put it in my vault. And then later on, I go and check the vault to see what it is when I try to log in. So again, that's pretty common. So some of these, so Windows password hashing. So when we store passwords with Microsoft Windows, it uses the, in the old days, the LM hash, but NTLM hash is a little bit more secure, well, marginally more secure, and is used on most modern versions of Windows for storing passwords. So in other words, we don't store the passwords in plain text. They're stored using their digest, and NTLM is the hashing algorithm that's used for that digest in Microsoft Windows. Incidentally, in other operating systems, you'll find digest using SHA-1 or MD5, hopefully something better than MD5. As you probably have learned in other classes, MD5 is not terribly secure. And key stretching is basically when we use a hashing algorithm that is intentionally designed to slower the ability of the attacker to crack passwords because it requires more processing time and memory in order to crack those passwords. So that's what the book is discussing when they talk about key stretching. It just takes longer to calculate those hashes. And along those lines, salts can also make it much more difficult. So even if you have a rainbow list, salts will usually make rainbow lists much more difficult. It'll make dictionary attacks, to make all of those types of attacks a lot more difficult when you're using salting. That's not to say that it makes them impossible. It just makes them more difficult. So the next factor of authentication is something that you have. So it's some object that you have in your possession that you have to have in your possession in order to get access to a system. When we talk about multi-factor authentication, it's using more than one type of authentication credential. So for example, we talked about passwords, which is something that you know. Typically, multi-factor authentication is something that you know and something that you have. So that's the most common method of multi-factor authentication. I'd say by and large, when you hear about multi-factor authentication, probably 99 times out of 100, it is something that you know and something that you have. Single factor would be just something that you have or just something that you know, or any one of these different factors that we're discussing. So commonly, items that are commonly used for authentication are tokens, cards, and cell phones. So a token is usually just a small device, typically on a keychain. It's got a little display window on it, typically, and that display window is going to periodically change say a PIN number or a one-time access password or OTP that periodically changes. They look a little like this. This is just a drawing of one. Kind of looks a little like an RSA key. So RSA is one of the major companies that makes these access tokens. They're not cheap, they're not expensive, but when you multiply times 7,000 users and everyone has to have one and people lose them periodically or they get cracked or something like that, it can be a little bit costly to implement this, but if the security requirements are important and you need to have multi-factor authentication, this is one of the options that you have. So standard passwords are static and don't change unless the user is forced to create a new one. But the tokens produce dynamic passwords that change frequently. So that token changes every so often. With time-based one-time password, the change is happening after a set period of time, usually anywhere from 30 to 60 seconds, depending on which manufacturer you're using for the token. RSA tokens, for example, change every 60 seconds. So after the user enters their username and their password, then they enter the code that's displayed on their keychain. And then they're granted access to whatever resource they're looking for. So you can see how it'd be a lot more difficult to crack a system if you have to have that token because that code changes every 60 seconds. You can't grab somebody's key fob, write down the code, and an hour later try to access the system. It won't work. The code has already changed. So where some of these tokens are time-based one-time passwords, sometimes they are HMAC based, where the password is event driven and changes with specific event occurs. So for example, if you try to log into your Gmail account, it might prompt for you to enter a PIN number that's displayed on your phone, for example. A lot of services now do this, where when you try to log in, when something happens, it triggers the one-time password to display somewhere that you plug it in. So where those RSA keys change every 60 seconds, no matter what, HMAC base is going to change periodically based on an event that happens. Another object that we use typically is cards or smart cards. Basically, a smart card is a little card that has a chip in it. This is what it looks like. But most of our credit cards now have our smart cards. They have that little chip. I'm sure all of you have had to deal with inserting your credit card. It takes a little longer than the old days where you could just swipe it. Although I think the technology is getting a little bit better, so it's starting to get a little bit faster. But you have to have the card physically with you. If you think about your credit card in the old days, if you went to charge your card and you didn't have the card with you, they could put the number in for the card. So theoretically, you could charge somebody by just plugging in the number for their credit card. But then the smart card is much more secure because it's guaranteed that the only way somebody could be using that card is if the card was physically in their hand. So it adds one level of authentication. And the credit card companies handle this by, they sort of incentivize using the smart card for the merchants because they make them pay a little less in processing fees when the card is physically there. And the reason for that, of course, is because there's less risk doing it that way. So it's all about the risk. Smartphones is one of the other options we have. So with smartphones, all of those tokens that I mentioned before can be run from a smartphone. So in the old days, for our time-based access control, our time-based one-time passwords, you had to have that little keychain. Now you can install an app on your smartphone. And likewise, you can install an app on your smartphone for the HMAC one-time passcode, or you can simply text somebody their one-time password to a smartphone. Or sometimes it could pop up on the smartphone. If you have an Android phone and you try to access Gmail from a new computer that you've never been on before, if you have it set up, it automatically sends a prompt on your smartphone, and all you have to do is hit the yes button on your smartphone, and that sends a message back to Google to let you log in from this new machine. So it's kind of neat how that works, but that's natively in Android now. Next is what you are. So one of the other factors is what you are. So in addition to authenticating based on what a person knows or has, we can also look at the actual person. So what you are can be biometrics, it could be cognitive. So some biometric examples, this could be physical characteristics. So a fingerprint, for example, is biometrics. Face scans, hand scanners, eye characteristics, which might be retina scans and things like that. They're commonly used in physical security. So for example, if you clock in at your job, you might put your palm on a special machine, and that's how they identify you. When I was a kid and had a job where you clocked in, you could grab your buddy's time clock card and clock in your buddy because they were running late that day, because you're trying to be nice, and then they could show up 15 minutes late and no one would know. But that's not possible with most modern time clocks because you put your palm on the machine. So biometric disadvantages, number one, is the cost of the hardware scanning devices. Biometrics sounds great on paper because it's so secure you can't fake it. You can't fake a handprint, you can't fake a fingerprint. I mean, you can, but it's so much more difficult to do that. So it's definitely a good way to authenticate, but all of that equipment costs money. So there's definitely a cost there. They're also not foolproof either. It might reject an authorized user. I don't know if any of you have a fingerprint scanner on your phone, but they don't always work, right? So sometimes they don't work right. You scan it and it doesn't work. You try it again, then you get in. And likewise, it is possible that it's going to accept an unauthorized user. That it's going to if it can make a mistake of not letting you in, even though it's really you, the technology could also accidentally let someone in that isn't really you. So it can go both ways, although that's much more rare, but it could happen. So errors are mainly due to the many characteristics that must be scanned and compared. So this is rather complex. So there's lots of things that can go wrong. So fingerprint consists of ridges and valleys in the upper skin layer segments of the finger, and the valleys are the lower segments. You have static fingerprint scanners, which takes a picture and compares it to an image file. You have dynamic fingerprint scanners, which use a small slit or an opening where you slide your finger across the slit. This is how most cell phones work, where you slide it across that little slit and there's a little scanner. Cognitive biometrics is more about how our brains work and how we do things. It's related to perception, thought process, and understanding of a user. So it's considered to be much easier for a user to remember and more difficult for an attacker to imitate because it's difficult to imitate how someone thinks. Picture gesture authentication for touch-enabled devices. So that's when, with your phone, you make a gesture with the phone that lets you in. I'm sure some of you have something like that. Identifying a specific face, recalling a memorable event. Those are all cognitive authentication. In your textbook, there is a practical assignment where you're going to try a cognitive authentication system that uses facial recognition. And this isn't the system recognizing your face. It's where the system brings up faces that it asks you, do you recognize any of these? So when you first set up your account, it shows you a sort of a grid of pictures of people, and you select the ones that you think look familiar to you. And then later on, they show you other faces, and you have to tell them which ones you think are familiar from the ones that you saw originally. And it's surprisingly difficult to attack that, but it's an interesting concept. It's also a little bit difficult for some users to understand what's going on. So it's definitely not something I think is going to be in common usage, but it's kind of neat to take a look at it. Next, we have what you do. And so this is behavioral biometrics, which looks at how you do things, or how you type or how you speak are good examples. So keystroke dynamics and voice recognition. Keystroke dynamics is when you're looking at how the user actually types. What's the rhythm? There's certain idiosyncrasies about how all of us type. If you look around the room, everybody types a little bit different. Some people type, touch type. Some people use two fingers. People type at different speeds, at different cadences, and you can measure all that up to 98% accuracy. Not 100%, but 98%, which is pretty good. So they can look at things like dwell time, how long it takes to press and release a key. The flight time, which is the time between keystrokes. And you can compile all this stuff, and you can analyze it to figure out if it's likely that the person who's typing is the same user, or it's more likely it's somebody who's not that user based on their patterns of how they type. So there are programs now that actually look at that keystroke data. In the lab, I actually ask you in the practical assignment to take a look at that and try one of these systems with Keystroke Dynamics to see. You're going to type some stuff on a keyboard and then have somebody else type, and it's going to tell you that they're not the same person. It's smart enough to see that. And I think you'll find in a classroom of, say, 20 students that it is probably close to 100% accurate when it makes that determination. Then we have voice recognition, which is also something unique to us. So there are different characters about voices that can be analyzed to try to identify whether someone is who they say they are. So voice recognition is another option. This is not terribly common yet, but the technology does exist to use voice recognition. It's difficult to use it over the web and things like that, so it's not in common use right now, but it's something I think that we may see in the future. And then finally, where you are, using geolocation, for example. If you know that somebody is trying to access the system from China, but that person was in New York 2 minutes ago, then there's probably a problem, right? Something isn't right in that case. So that's a little bit about using geolocation, of basically just knowing where someone is to determine what they should and shouldn't be able to do. Finally, I'm just going to talk about single sign-on briefly, but this is becoming very important, single sign-on. Many of you probably are familiar with the pain of having many different passwords for all these different systems we have to access in our daily lives. And usually there's not much we can do about that except using some kind of password management utility. But when it's all inside an organization, so let's say you work in an organization that has many different resources that have to be accessed with different accounts, this is something that we can manage, and hopefully we can find a way to make it so that users don't have to have multiple accounts to access multiple systems, even if it's multiple different vendors. And there's a couple different ways to do that, but the idea with single sign-on is we want to try to limit the number of accounts or individual accounts that are required to access different systems, and there's a couple different reasons to do this. The first is, of course, for password weakness. We don't want people having to try to keep track of lots of different passwords to lots of different systems, because they're going to use weaker passwords because of the number of systems they have to access. So that's one thing. The second part, the second major reason that we don't want to do that is we want to have one source of truth for all passwords in an organization. That way, anytime somebody makes a change to a password, if we have to remove a user account or add new user accounts, it reduces the complexity in those tasks. So single sign-on is becoming important, and it's basically, when we look at single sign-on, basically it's identity management. It's some server or some service on the network that manages identification to resources on the network. So it provides some service to resources that they can use to vet the identity of a user, kind of like we use the DMV to vet the identity of everyone in the real world. If you go to the airport and you want to fly somewhere, the TSA checks your DMV issued driver's license because they trust the DMV. It's sort of an authority that they can trust. So it works in a decentralized environment, but it feels more centralized because you have one account. One of the ways that most companies have done single sign-on is using Microsoft's Active Directory. So Microsoft started started making these domain controllers or Active Directory servers back in the 90s, and today they're pretty ubiquitous. Almost every company is using Active Directory, and not only can you use Active Directory in the Microsoft environment, but it also works even outside the Microsoft ecosystem. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how that works when we talk about authorization later on in this unit. So again, that's Microsoft. OpenID is another service out there. It's not really a service; it's sort of an open source system for sharing authentication information online. And this would be between different organizations, usually something like OpenID. And likewise, open authorizations, OAuth 2.0 is also a standard that's being used that basically it allows you to log in to and access resources. But really, it's more about identification, right? So it allows you to log in from multiple different resources or multiple different systems. And it provides a token for you to use for a short period of time to access those resources. So that's open authorization. So Microsoft Active Directory, Microsoft Accounts is sort of a proprietary way of doing this, the single sign-on. Then OpenID and OAuth 2.0 are sort of more open source methods, and different services and applications support different methods. I would say that for internal to an organization, Microsoft Active Directory is certainly one of the most common ways of doing single sign-on. But when we have to extend resource access outside the organization or across organizational boundaries, that's where we usually see things like OpenID and Open Authorization 2.0 for authentication outside the organizational boundary. All right, so that's it for authentication. The other topic in this unit is going to be authorization.